I invite you all to displace yourselves with me and this room only for a moment and place yourselves in 18th century imperial Spain, locked in this room under the sunset of your life. Teresa Juliana Santo Domingo, known in life as Chicava, died in Salamanca, Spain, within the cloistered confines of the convent of La Penitencia in 1748, with her death, like her life, imbued with paradox. As a former enslaved woman, Teresa's life was shaped by the brutality of chattel slavery, serving first in the court of King Charles II of Spain, the Bewitched, and later in the households of the Marquesas de Mancera, Antonio Sebastián de Toledo Molina, and Juliana Teresa Portocarrero, former protectors of the renowned Mexican poet, philosopher, and composer, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Born in Costa de la Mina Baja del Oro, present-day Ghana, Togo, and Benin, Chicava was the first Black woman admitted into a cloistered community in Spain and the first known Black poet to produce texts in a modern European language. Yet, upon receiving her freedom and the death of her enslavers, Teresa chose a life of voluntary confinement, taking tertiary vows as a lay sister. As the first Black woman to accomplish this goal, her decision to remain cloistered remained radical and deliberate. For Teresa, freedom was not external but spiritual. What her hagiographer described as the pangs of love, el padecer del amor, was a vocation to transcend worldly bondage through divine union. This choice transformed the convent into a space of paradoxical liberation, challenging the linear binaries of captivity and emancipation articulated in Western European epistemologies. Teresa's life and death compel us to reevaluate freedom as an abstract ideal and lived reality, particularly within the framework of Afro-Hispanic spiritual practices. By embodying a form of freedom that reconciles the seeming opposites of restriction and transcendence, Teresa's story critiques the prevailing Eurocentric paradigms of autonomy and individualism. Her life resituates freedom not in material emancipation shaped by the self in relation to the realm of the material, but in the metaphysical domain of the spirit, offering an alternative conception of liberty grounded in theological and existential exploration. In Freedom as Marronage, Neil Roberts redefines the concept of freedom by examining the liminal space between enslavement and liberation, emphasizing marronage as a critical mode of fugitive resistance. Traditionally, marronage refers to the physical flight of enslaved individuals who formed autonomous communities outside the structures of colonial domination. As Freedom as Marronage contends, Marronage addresses a group of persons isolating themselves from a surrounding society to create a fully autonomous community. More specifically so, in the language of the marooned societies of the colonial Jamaica, Suriname, Cuba, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Colombia, and Mexico, they thus became defined in Spanish and Portuguese as quilombos, palenques, mocambos, cumbes, mambises, rancherias, laderas, macotes, y manieres. Marron in French, or cimarron in Spanish, links in its historical definition the color brown to the racialized implications of the Amerindian, the indigenous person of the Americas, and the former enslaved African who escaped chattel slavery to create isolated communities away from the colonial metropolis. Roberts, however, extends his marronage to encompass broader forms of resistance, positing that freedom exists not merely as a destination, but as a process of movement and rapture. Marronage disrupts the binary of bondage and freedom by emphasizing the transformative potential inherent in the act of fleeing oppression, not only materially, but also psychologically. This paper thus applies Robert's framework to the spiritual lives of two Afro-Hispanic mystics, Teresa Juliana Santo Domingo and her contemporary Ursula de Jesus, who lived in Peru, while briefly noting the history of the pathologizing of this kind of cognitive freedom as hysteria in Western European psychoanalysis and subsequently continental philosophy. Though confined within convents, both Teresa and Ursula articulated a vision of freedom that transcended the physical through the theological and mystical practices. By reframing marronage as a spiritual rather than spatial flight, I argue that Teresa and Ursula expanded the dimensions of freedom to include cognitive and metaphysical realms. Their lives illuminate how freedom can emerge not in opposition to confinement, paradoxically, through it as an intellectual and spiritual reclamation of agency. Teresa's embrace of confinement as a site of freedom exemplifies spiritual marronage, transforming the convent into a realm of resistance against the humanizing forces of slavery and colonialism. While Roberts frames marronage as a flight, sorry, From physical enslavement, Teresa's life reframes its flight as an inward journey, a metaphysical exodus into divine communion, the actual dimensions of what I call spiritual marronage. Her hagiography describes this process as a soul's liberation through divine love, a love so consuming that it obliterates the boundaries of the identity imposed by her enslaved past. This spiritual transcendence resonates with Robert's notions of the liminal space between freedom and bondage, where the act of fleeing is itself an assertion of autonomy. Teresa's confinement, thus, in the convent, far from signifying submission, becomes a radical redefinition of freedom as a capacity to pursue transcendence within structural limitations. Her theological reflections dismantle the Eurocentric narrative of freedom as self sovereignty, replacing it with a vision rooted in divine relationality and mystical surrender. Ursula Jesus, like Teresa, experienced enslavement before entering convent life, where she reimagined her existence as one of spiritual liberation. Ursula's mystical visions and writings function as acts of theological resistance, critiquing the
All
colonial
right,
order that defined
all
her
right.
life,
This guy is on. I'll go in the bathroom.
interceding for enslaved souls in
Maybe the
particular,
wrong time.
the racial and social hierarchies of her time, asserting the moral and spiritual worth of those deemed subhuman by colonial systems. In Ursula's visionary narratives, the convent becomes a liminal space where earthly hierarchies dissolve, replaced by divine justice and mercy. Her insistence on interceding for others demonstrates how the mystics thought of serving as a communal act of resistance, bridging the divide between individual spiritual experience and broader systematic critique. Like Teresa, Ursula embodies a form of marronage that transcends the boundaries of confinement into, uh, into opportunities for radical reimagination, challenging the colonial narrative of subjugation thought through her theological agency. The lives and writings of Teresa Jimenez Santo Domingo and Ursula de Jesus reveal a conception of freedom that transcends physical emancipation, situated in liberation within the spiritual and cognitive domains. By engaging in what Roberts might term metaphysical marronage, these women redefine the boundaries of freedom to include the unboundedness of the soul in divine communion. Their experiences challenge Western philosophical traditions that equate freedom with self sovereignty, offering instead a vision of autonomy rooted in relationality, resistance, and transcendence. Through the lens of spiritual marronage, Teresa and Ursula eliminate the capacity of what has been deemed as mystical or contemplative practices to resist and reconfigure oppressive structures. Their lives invite us to reconsider the relationship between confinement and liberation, demonstrating how freedom can emerge not despite but through the very limitations imposed by historical conditions. This paper thus aims to deepen our understanding of freedom as a multidimensional, gendered, racialized social construct, expanding its philosophical and theological implications beyond the constraints of physical emancipation. Teresa and Santo Domingo embrace of negative theology, particularly, not only reflects a profound alignment with an apophatic tradition like the ones articulated by St. John of the Cross in Spain, who lived in her city, but also functions as a subversive theological strategy that dismantles the imperial epistemic violence that has been placed upon the Black body. Negative theology, with its insistence on the visibility of divine love, becomes for Teresa a means to challenge the rigid dogmas of colonial Catholicism that sought to control how spirituality and subjectivity could be expressed. Her reflections on divine absence as the condition for the fullness of divine presence thus serve as a radical critique of limitations imposed by colonial hierarchies. Poetically, she articulates her theology as follows: O Jesus, where have you gone? Because instantly I can't see myself without you. O Jesus of my soul, where have you gone? Because it seems that you are not coming and have gotten lost. O Jesus, what shall I say? If you go with other women, what shall I do? I will scream, I will cry until I see God, and if not, die of love. And I say more, since I'm so alone because you have not come. And if you are with another, I have already seen it. Martha and Mary you have loved. O Jesus, where shall I find you? So silly I am left wherein I have you. Goodbye, goodbye, love. Goodbye, Lord. Goodbye, heart. No more, no more, no more. Teresa's metaphorical death, yearning for divine embrace, or we call it the manifestation of her death drive, underscores how the mystics operate as both an articulation of and an escape from the limitations of her identity. Similarly, Ursula's intercessions for the enslaved and her critiques of colonial hierarchies reveal how mysticism provided a cognitive space where the social order could be reimagined. Both women's writings thus illustrate how spiritual practices can serve as routes for intellectual and moral resistance, bridging the chasm between the material and the transcendent. The position in the cognitive space of her poetic meditations within the paradox of surrender and divine unknowability, Teresa advances a mode of intellectual resistance that reclaims spiritual agency in the face of racial and gender oppression. For instance, her meditations on divine love as an ineffable presence dismantle the hegemonic structures of theological certainty, replacing them with a vision of liberation rooted in the uncontainable nature of God. This act of reclaiming the ineffable is not merely theological, it's profoundly political, illustrating how negative theology enables Teresa to transform the confines of her existence into a site of metaphysical rebellion. Ursula de Jesus extends this tradition of resistance by using her mystical vision to reorder the moral and spiritual hierarchies of her world, situating her writing as an act of embodied critique against colonial power structures. Her visionary accounts are not only passive reflections of divine grace, but deliberate interventions into the systems of oppression that sought to circumscribe her agency as an Afro-Hispanic woman. Ursula's spiritual diary, for example, does not merely record her ecstatic experiences or encounters, but actively reinterprets them to highlight the failures of colonial morality. This reinterpretation is particularly evident in Ursula's visions of divine justice, which challenge not only her former enslavers, but also the broader racialized logic of colonial Catholicism. Through these visions, Ursula appropriates the language of divine authority to assert her own spiritual power, effectively subverting the structures that sought to render her invisible. By framing her intercessions as acts of justice, Ursula's mysticism resists both the material and epistemic violence of her time, showcasing how embodied spirituality becomes a route for intellectual and moral resistance. The convent, thus, while often perceived as a space of confinement, emerges as a paradoxical site where the constraints of gender and social hierarchy intersect with the possibility of theological and intellectual subversion. For Teresa and Ursula, the cloister provided a gender space where spiritual and cognitive resistance could flourish, albeit within the strictures of conventional life. Their positioning within this liminal space allowed them to engage in theological reflection while subtly reconfiguring the power dynamics that govern their lives. This reconfiguration is evident in the ways both women appropriated the language of humility and obedience to assert their spiritual authority. Teresa's meditations on the soul's freedom within divine love, for instance, do not merely accept the constraints of conventional life, but transform them into a metaphor for spiritual liberation, one where she sees herself as an equal to Mary and Martha. Similarly, Ursula's role as a donata, while marking her as a subordinate, became a platform from which she could critique the racial and social hierarchy of the community. In both cases, the convent becomes a space where the paradox of freedom within limitations is enacted, revealing how gendered and sexualized spaces could be repurposed for acts of theological defiance. The altered states of consciousness experienced by Teresa and Ursula highlight the intersection of the mystics with psychoanalytic theories of hysteria, demonstrating how their embodied practices reframe what early 20th century psychoanalysis pathologized as a cognitive deficit. Freud and Bauer, whose characterization of hysteria as representative trauma, fails to account for the radical agency embedded in Teresa's ecstatic experiences and Ursula's visionary critiques. Their practice, rather than functioning as a symptom of psychic fracture, reclaims these altered states as sites of divine encounter and liberation. The mystical practices of Teresa and Ursula must be understood not only as individual acts of faith, but as a collaborative form of Marronage that reimagines freedom beyond the material constraints of their historical conditions. By engaging in ecstatic states and spiritual flights, they enacted a metaphysical fugitive practice that resisted the colonial logic of domination and subjugation. This practice, which Roberts describes as liminal freedom, transforms the boundaries of their confinement into spaces of radical possibility. By situating their mystical practices within the broader philosophical and theological traditions of negative theology, Marronage and psychoanalysis, Teresa Jimenez Santo Domingo and Ursula de Jesus illuminated profound interconnectedness, spiritual and cognitive resistance. Their writings reveal how the ineffable nature of divine love and justice becomes a site for challenging colonial hierarchies, asserting spiritual authority, and reclaiming freedom within confinement. Their mystic practices, far from being a retreat into the private realm, engage deeply with their world's political and social dimensions. Teresa and Ursula redefined freedom as the condition of the body, but as a cognitive and spiritual state, offering a vision of resistance that transcends the limitations of their material circumstances. By reframing altered states of consciousness as acts of divine encounter rather than symptoms of hysteria, or simply a disavowal of Christian orthodoxy, their writings challenge the pathologizing gaze of patriarchal psychoanalysis, illuminating how embodied mysticism serves as a powerful tool for intellectual and moral liberation. Their legacies thus compel us to rethink the boundaries of freedom, spirituality, and resistance in the face of oppression, offering enduring insights into the transformative power of faith and the human capacity for resilience. Thank you.
Put you in first. Excuse me, I'll come around to that. And thank you again.
Thank you, Nathan, for that paper. I totally resonate with Ursula Jesus talking about a place of spiritual and cognitive resilience to have a theological strategy to get through oppression, right? And my question is, you did mention in part that there's a moment after withdrawing from that construct that then it does affect the larger socio-political sphere. And my question is, what does that look like? Because I understand that Ursula retreats, and that is what provides her with emotional resilience. And absolutely, there are times to do that. But then what's next? Do we then take that strength and that resilience and come back to affect our socio-political culture? Or must we remain in that spiritual marina to be able to just exist until what point? Until what happens?
So there's something quite interesting in her writings. So her writings are not exactly published through her or by her, but by the person who received all her biography of her life and then rewrote it to be the life of a saint. So there's something curious about her life, which is the fact that she not only retrieved herself, because she sought to serve others that were next to her. So something that I didn't mention in the paper is the fact that she, for instance, was believed to use her saliva for healing people. Another thing that was used, again, all these are parts of the ways in which Catholic saints achieve their status. Currently in Salamanca, they're still fighting for her to become a saint because for them it's something that's socially important to become available, having a Black woman poet and a saint in that space. But something curious about these mystics in Salamanca, just as Saint John of the Cross or Saint Teresa of Avila, is that they do not see their lives as simply being confined. They are thinking of ways to reframe for them the church in the first place. So Saint John of the Cross is creating new convents, creating a new order. Saint Teresa of Avila is writing to other nuns around her town. And Chikara, although she may not have had that access that they had, she sought to make that available in her confined space. So she was helping other women in that space, helping other people, even because being a tertiary nun, she was allowed to get out a bit and then come back. But something that I think is quite interesting of her life is just the fact that instead of fleeing from the entire space, she sought to work with them physically, but also reconfigure her spiritual life to find a way to intercede for souls. And the way, just a quick footnote, which is, as I read the mystics, I'm not reading them as simply this person has experiences based on a theological conviction, but rather as embodied practices. And people may not see it differently if we talk about psychedelics, or if we talk about other forms of achieving these states. The point is that they had the experiences. And for them, it was a point for inspiration to help others. So in her hallucinations, we call it, or even her dreams or visions, she's seen herself helping others in that metaphysical space. And I think is what combines her theology, making a complete one in the outside realm, but also within their content.
Question on two things. One is, I'm thinking of like Hildegard, there's a number of other mystics, and weeping was a very important part of their spirituality. I'm curious if there's any reflections with Ursula, psychosis. The second thing is, you made a reference to Mary and Martha. I'm curious of other female figures that she would refer to as perhaps inspiration and sources for spirituality.
So addressing your last question first, she addresses Mary Martha and then Mary, the mother of Jesus. Given that her writings have been filtered to her biographers, we do not really have her thought process. It's more like, here's this amazing woman who did all these wonderful things. And she said this one thing this one time. She wrote this one poem this one time. So we are getting her voice filtered. But something that in her little voice that she appears through her writings, she does address Mary, the mother of Jesus, as another point of inspiration for her, which is again another common trope for these lives. But within this space, something that I find quite interesting too is the fact that just like Hildegard, they envision this space with different images, right? So in the poem that I read that she wrote, she talks about screaming and about yelling for God. There are no instances exactly of her screaming or yelling, but something that I found particularly poetic and beautiful of her experience that she's recorded is that she would find herself so in love with God that she would start like kind of screaming in the midst of a space. I think of it almost like, praise and worship that are also part of other African and African American spiritual practices. People that raise their hands and, that is part of her spirituality and that's mentioned there. So while they're not mention weeping as I'm sad or I'm like just uncontrollably sharing tears, but they share more as expressions of joy, which I think are, again, we talk about the pathologizing nature of reading hysteria with these women. It kind of goes back into the pathology of, the symptoms that go with it, which is, screaming or yelling in this particular moments. But I found her experience in that moment, like to be something interesting. They do mention her having this ecstasies, but they are usually joyous. I'm not sure if there always were, because we're getting her voice filtered, but I think it's quite interesting to see that she found a space where she could be quote unquote free in her mind, and therefore she sewn herself into that confinement.
Thank you, Nathan, for a wonderfully done paper and presentation. As I was listening to you give your presentation, the phrase that kept popping up in my mind is the politics of the apophatic, the politics of mysticism. And in thinking through this, I'm wondering if there's not a politics to the cataphatic as well, right? I'm thinking of the difference between the saying and the said in Levinas, right? The said becomes a political ontology, a sort of definiteness, a fixed way of seeing the world, which seems to me to be the world outside of her confinement, right? Outside of their confinement. But she finds a way through problematizing epistemic desire to know God, right? And to articulate with logical precision various positions about God. She is doing something deeply subversive. And so I wanted to make that point, and I wanted to ask you, in what sense do you think that these two women may prefigure others who came much later, who did philosophically subversive work while incarcerated, right? So I'm thinking of Boethius, I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I'm thinking of Antonio Gramsci, Martin Luther King, letter from Birmingham jail, and last but not least, in what sense may these two women prefigure Angela Davis, who of course wrote a dissertation on Hegel's study with Herbert Marcuse, and she writes a powerful essay called "If They Come in the Morning," and she edits this book from a jail cell, right? So I'm just curious to see if you think these two women kind of prefigure freedom movements that come much later than them.
I would say most definitely. As I study this, it's kind of hard sometimes to create the links of create a genealogy of knowledge because they're often not known. I studied my master's in Salamanca, and I lived 10 minutes away from the place where she died, right? And my professors didn't know who she was. Most people around me didn't know who she was. They had a museum about her, but the city is almost 1,000 years old. So they had a bunch of old things that people would love to see. But that was not one of the things people were highlighting. So I realized it's sometimes hard to create that genealogy of knowledge, and as I'm historicizing her writings, it's rather important for me to locate them in that moment. But I think that the experience, right, the Black experience transnationally, um, has so many similar elements that create a genealogy very clearly for us to see. I think her confinement, and that's something that I try to do with also putting her conversation with her sister in Peru, because they are in different continents, they are living almost a century apart, but they have similar experiences that lead them to do similar acts. And I think there is something to say about the cataphatic that, in my opinion, it's framed within what you can and cannot do. This is about, right? Like we would have with Spivak to say, like, who can speak, right? Who is able to speak? And some people would say that she's not exactly speaking because she's filtered. So we're not getting her real voice, and that thus she's dying by not speaking. But the thing is almost paradoxical to have in her poem, her own death. And her hagiographer says about that is, oh, look at her, she's so happy, singing to God and being jealous of Jesus by seeing him with Mary and Mark. But she's writing about her death as she ends the poem. So I think there's something to be said about the cataphatic also being in line of what can we do in the face of oppression when we have that cognitive ability to do so. Because I think that there's a lot of people who can't address that because you're not in the mental space to even start that. And I think that's what the mystics has kind of come to embody, which is there are limitations. In this case, as a Black woman in Spain, being the first of her kind to be in a convent, to be allowed to be even in the space of her sisters, they did not even bury her next to them because they didn't want her to be in the same space that they were in when she died. So seeing those spaces kind of made me question how more cataphatic she would have been had she been allowed to speak her voice truly. Should we not have her voice filtered? How much cataphatic could we read her being? So I would say yes, of course, there's a connection between the two of them, and I think some scholars would even argue that it cannot have the apophatic but the cataphatic present in it within every author.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.